He watched her from the shadow of a shuttered cafe as she slipped a small envelope from the inside pocket of her coat and tucked it into the crook of a man's wrist like a benediction. The man's smile was quick and businesslike. Elena's eyes, when they flicked to Luca, held something that wasn't fear, wasn't even guilt, but a sharp, private calculation. For 3 years, she had been his compass and his calm, the woman who could straighten his schedule and read the subtext of an ally's late-night text. Now she handed a sliver of his world to someone whose face Luca didn't recognize and didn't want to. The wind took the tremor from her sleeve. He wanted to move then, to cross the street and grab her by the elbow and demand every secret she'd ever kept. Instead, he folded himself into the city's dark convenience and watched until the man disappeared into the tram doors and Elena walked, slow and steady, away from him and straight toward the river. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He let the river take her silhouette and the memory of that small envelope, because Luca Moretti had always been ruthless about one thing: evidence. Suspicions were a luxury in his line of work. Proof was the currency that allowed him to move from anger to action without being pulled under. He had followed her because the leaks had become brazen, logistics messages intercepted, a shipment rerouted before his men could secure it, favored contacts suddenly compromised. Competence was a rare scent in his offices, and Elena's composure had always been pure oxygen. That composure now smelled faintly of betrayal. 3 years ago, she'd arrived at his headquarters, a glass cube suspended over the city, lights of his empire reflected like constellations in the glass. Elena Rivas had stepped through the revolving door with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop a moment and find their morning softer for it. Bilingual, precise, seemingly without need or pretense, she adjusted his cufflinks once when a sleeve slipped, scheduled a cremation appointment with the courtesy of someone used to grief, and once ordered him double espresso with the exactitude of a ritual. He learned the hours of his temper and the rituals that kept him human, the playlist he returned to when a deal went sideways, the way he read classic novels in shorthand to remind himself of consequence. He had trusted her with manifestos and names, and, against better instincts, with the scraps of himself he could not show anyone else. Trust, in his world, was leverage. He thought he knew the price. Luca had been born into this life as if fate had signed his name on its ledgers. The Moretti Syndicate was not an accident. It was architecture. He ran markets that hummed in the dark net's undercurrent, owned shipping lines with registrars who pretended not to know, and had attorneys who read law like prayer books. He believed in codes, old loyalties braided with modern ruthlessness, and he believed in control. When his rivals moved like chess pieces 2 steps ahead, when an informant disappeared the very night before he was supposed to speak, Luca's first reaction was not love or longing, it was inventory. He counted variables like coins, who had access to manifests, which systems showed patterns, which men had idle mouths. Elena's role had been tidy. She kept his day from unraveling and his enemies from finding the small seam in his mask. Her reputation inside the firm was nearly mythic. Her calmness seemed to smooth friction from his life. People joked that he would collapse into chaos should she ever fall ill. He never expected her to be the source of the storm. He did not expect either the way following her would unspool the private architecture between them. He followed her because he could not afford blind spots. He followed her because, quietly, she was the only person he allowed to know when he slipped into the softer, thin skin beneath iron. Elena had a history that sat at the base of her throat like a sharp coin you could see in her jawline. Before Moretti, she'd been a cybersecurity analyst, Brilliant, quick, temperament of a woman who could read raw code the way others read faces. She'd worked a year at a firm contracted to a global bank. She'd taught herself to dig through server logs like archaeology, knowing which bits to keep and which to discard. Her younger brother, Matteo, had been caught in a debt with an old rival cartel. The kind of debt that did not forgive by time, only by payment. The man who held Matteo's freedom wanted more than money. He wanted leverage, and leverage was bought with information. Elena, practical and fierce, had taken the Moretti job because the pay was clean, and the proximity to power was insurance of its own. The office gave her schedules and codes. The underworld gave her the means to repair a family that had been folded into the harsh ledger of organized debt. She had never planned to slip into espionage. But debts have the loosened gravity of small suns. They pull and demand until the orbit of a life changes. When she first siphoned fragments of shipping manifests, crumbs that could be sold to those who would pay, she told herself it was temporary. Wire the buyers enough to placate the men who knelt over her brother's cage. No one she loved would be touched if she could keep the flames at bay. Each morsel took a little of her away, but each morsel bought grace for Matteo. Survival, she had learned, often asks you to lie to the world and be honest to a smaller, secret self that you protect at all costs. Luca's boots made no sound on the tram platform as Elena boarded, her phone tucked into her palm like a rosary. He watched the way she texted with quick efficiency, the little pauses when she typed and erased sentences. She smiled at a message and then closed the phone, a practiced privacy. He could have approached her there, in the hum of transit, and demanded explanation. Instead, he held his tongue because men like him knew the cost of confrontation without knowledge. He followed her home through streets that smelled of late winter and oil and the particular staleness of the city's underbelly. When she ducked into a nondescript building 2 blocks from the river, an office on the ground floor with a basement workshop that smelled of solder and instant coffee, he let the shadow of ivy hide him and watched as she disappeared behind a door. He had never been to Elena's neighborhood. His life orbited penthouses and private terminals, not low roofs and old brick. Watching her move through that world was like tracing a private map drawn beneath the public one he knew. She lived in a modest flat above a locksmith and a bakery that made bread in the hours he slept. The flat's light came on, as if to reassure the night that someone inside was awake. When she opened an old laptop, the glow from the screen painted her cheekbones blue. He nearly laughed. He, who had paid hackers to bleach a server's memory clean, could have done the same to this small, clever woman and avoided all this messy human witnessing. Instead, he found himself seated where he could hear the faint clack of keys and the soft, low murmur of her speaking in Spanish to someone on the phone. She hung up, closed the laptop, and tucked her feet beneath her like a child settling into a story. The intimacy of the scene pierced him with a slow, unfamiliar tenderness. The puzzle pieces began to rearrange over the days following his shadowing. A pattern in the leaks that matched deliveries scheduled under Elena's watch. An unusual list of IP addresses pinging their servers at odd hours. All breadcrumb trails that led to the same small pocket of the web where ghost buyers laundered their purchases. Luca's men combed the city for the man who received the envelope by the river and came back with nothing but cigarette ash and false alibis. Meanwhile, his conversations with Elena remained unremarkable on the surface. He spoke in the office about logistics and travel. He corrected an itinerary. He watched as she brewed coffee and placed it on his desk without being asked. She was impeccable in the ways that mattered to him. The double life she led hummed like a wire under the floorboards, tense and unseen. There was an odd choreography to their proximity now. Where once he had been able to speak in clipped, efficient sentences and be obeyed, he noticed the small things. How she lingered when delivering a file, as if wordless questions hovered between them. The way her laughter tightened at jokes that pried too near. The way she took his silence as if it was a room she could not enter. He told himself this was all tactical, close monitoring, protective oversight. He told himself not to let the soft ache that had begun in his chest find a name. But even as he counted the ways she might have betrayed him, Luca found himself cataloging the moments she had saved him, the list of donors she'd hidden from enemies, the single night she had smoothed a presence that might have otherwise become a thorn in his side. Trust, in his life, had been transactional. Elena made it porous. His dilemma came like winter light. With evidence pointing to Elena and a ledger of losses increasing daily, punishment would be easy and decisive. Public shaming, exile, a warning carved across her life that would make everyone else tidy their loyalties. But punishment would also burn the one person who had learned the ways of his compass and could read the map of his vulnerabilities. He could take vengeance and be safe for a season. Or he could ask her to answer for the truth and risk everything she might confess, including the names of those he still held dear. The question was a razor: what he wanted to do, what he needed to do, and what he feared to learn about himself if he followed justice to its logical end. Late one night, when a snow like powdered ash began to fall, he invited her into his office under a pretense of travel plans. The city outside the glass was softer, and for the first time since he had put his empire into motion, Luca felt the weight of loneliness like a physical thing, an actual ache at the base of his ribs. Elena stood with a folder in her hand, precisely as always, but tonight she also brought a tremor he had not seen before, the sort a person tries to hide with better posture and a calmer voice. She didn't know he had followed her. He watched her place her hand on the folder, watched the way his name crossed her features like a landscape in faint relief. He could have closed the door and demanded a confession. Instead, he said nothing, because he had learned that silence sometimes compels truth in a way violence never could. The moment brimmed with choices, each one a clean cut. He stepped back and let her speak first. Elena's voice came out tempered, careful, Spanish folded into English as if she were translating a prayer. "I need you to understand, Signore Moretti," she said, and the way she used his name was not servile and not intimate. It was simply an address. "My brother is—" She stopped, thumb smoothing the edge of the folder until the paper shuddered. "He owes a man who does not forgive mistakes. He took a job he couldn't finish. The price is not money anymore. It is favors, and for favors they ask for proof." Luca watched her through the tired lamplight that made the glass of his office look like another world. The winter snow outside whispered against the panes. He had expected a confession that would resemble treachery in all its theatricality. Gowns, accusations, a tearful implosion destined to make him look magnanimous in punishment. Instead, there was a small, practical woman with two dark eyes that refused to wring themselves dry, and a voice that measured what it admitted as if rationing truth were the only way to survive. "You sold information," he said. The words were not a question. They landed like an invoice. She nodded once. "Small things, orders of paper in the wrong ports, routes, nothing that puts people in immediate danger. I sold breadcrumbs so the men wouldn't take more." "And you thought I would not notice?" She looked at him with a clarity that almost hurt. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could balance both ledgers. I thought I could be useful to both sides and make sure Matteo made it out." The name slipped out like a coin. "I was wrong." Luca heard the practical apology and felt the old, dangerous muscle in him, retribution, flex. When betrayal was abstract, he could be distant. When betrayal sat across from him and named his brother, the knives sharpened differently. He imagined the ledger of his life and the numbers realigning. Every favor she had arranged, every passport she'd procured, every man she'd smoothed into the fold would have to be counted as potential poison. "You made a choice that affects my operations," he said, "and you lied." She closed her mouth like a hinge. "I lied to protect him. And if protecting him meant destroying 30 men, 2 shipments, the people who keep me safe?" His voice tightened. He had rehearsed every method of compliance and revenge. He had never rehearsed the ache that arrived when he imagined losing her care, her small mercies. "You sold me a seat on a boat to drown." Elena's hands trembled now, but she did not reach for the folder. "The buyers were not the Moretti rivals you think," she said. "They were someone else, cold and intricate in a way that felt wrong even to me. They told me what they wanted. Crumbs enough to keep my brother's men from breaking him, not the big things. They paid in cash and in threats. I was careful. I was—" She stopped, and the sentence hung like laundry in the room, wet and waiting. "I was afraid." Fear was a word Luca could respect. He had been raised in rooms where confession was a weakness and where fear was often a currency. He listened to the small sound of her breath and weighed it against the ledger of losses he had spent months tallying. The math did not favor mercy. And yet the data had gaps. There were anomalies in the logs that suggested someone else, someone with the knowledge to seed both sides and to profit from the confusion. "You worked for someone who wants us to bleed," he said slowly. "Not because of your loyalty, but because your loyalty can be bought. Someone is making investments in our failure." Elena's eyes widened in a way that made her look very much like the analyst he once imagined before she sat across from his life and made it better. "I thought it was a buyer. I didn't know it was a network." "You didn't know," he repeated. The phrase felt sharper the second time. He could imagine the network like an organism, nerves interlacing the city, feeding on secrets until it grew into a rival. The thought that someone had both the patience and the cruelty to compromise a person like Elena, one who valued small sanctities, made his jaw ache. He had been angry at her. Now he was angry at the world that had put them both in the same grid. A silence settled. It was not the diplomatic silence that had once filled his meetings. It hummed with new possibility. He could take her information and have her broken for it, a public lesson that would scare others into loyalty. He could also use her, her access, her knowledge, the fact that she moved in places he did not. It was a practical calculus, and Luca was always a man of calculus when it came to survival. "If this is true," he said, "there are 2 things you must do." She inhaled. "Anything." He listed them like decrees. "First, you will give me all the information you have. Every message, every buyer, every time you touched a manifest. You will not be spared the disgrace of exposure if you refuse. Second, you will work for me to find the network that compromised you." She saw his meaning and understood the trap in it. Working for him meant living under his control. Admitting everything meant exposing whomever had your brother hostage. "It would endanger Matteo," she protested, quiet and raw. "If they see me working for you, it could blow everything." "You will do it in a way that protects him," Luca said. "I will not have you sacrificed for a ledger." He wanted to believe his promise. He also wanted to believe that the man who held Matteo might view her cooperation as an escalation. He had been in the business long enough to mistrust men who trade in human currency. They argued in low measures until the clock on his wall seemed to decide it no longer wanted to keep time. Elena offered him what she could: names, partial IPs, phrases the buyers used. Luca read them like a man reading a map in a language he knew but had never loved. He realized with a cold prick that what she gave painted a constellation of an opponent he had considered a ghost. Matteo Caruso, a name that belonged to an older vendetta, a rumor of a man who never showed his face but who had killed loyalty for sport. "You know him?" Elena asked. Luca nodded once. Caruso was a story from his parents' era. Clean kills, economic strangulation, men who could blackmail entire ports with a story. If Caruso had resurfaced, it meant someone with patience and capital and a personal grudge had decided to pick at the seams of the old order. He disappears from the records. He leaves traces as easily as a lover leaves perfume. If he's involved, we need to move harder. They set rules. Elena would work under supervision, but surveillance that would not look like surveillance to those who watched her. She would be given a secure terminal within the compound, flickered into a sterile room where cameras could be coaxed to look away if needed. He surrounded her with the kind of control that felt like punishment and, to his surprise, like protection. The first days were improvisations in trust. Luca insisted that she use his men as endpoints for information, people he could vet. She bristled at first. Trust was not something you donated lightly, especially to a man who had entire districts of the human map kneeling at his command. But then she looked at the files he let her access, shipping manifests obfuscated in ways she recognized, lines of code highlighted in a hand she respected. He had the ways of an old ledger. He could read a system's history like scripture. Working together, they became something like a new animal. She with her fingers on keyboards, him with his shadow over the city. Emotion threaded through their days with the caution of stray electricity. Luca found himself standing in the doorway more than was strictly necessary, watching the rhythm of her jaw as she decrypted a string. Elena, who had always been a private woman, learned to navigate his questions like uncorking a bottle, carefully, slowly, a little of the truth at a time. They were close but never intimate. Her hands moved across paper and screens with a professional intimacy that left a residue on him, a sense that in another life, in another ledger, she might have been his equal in a softer office that loved small courtesies. Instead, she was the axis upon which his current life could tilt disastrously. A test came quicker than either of them wanted. A shipment, labeled as agricultural preservatives, but actually holding something more valuable, was due at dawn. Luca had rerouted it through a smaller port, a place their men controlled. The network, which had begun to feel like a patient animal circling its prey, struck first. The containers were interdicted not by brute force, but by a legal injunction filed by a shell company that had appeared overnight. The shipping manifests were altered at the registrar level. The ports had legal authority to hold them. Money was not the instrument this time. Paper was. "It's a signature," Elena said, her voice stripped down to numbers. She had run the logs and found, hidden among bureaucratic metadata, the fingerprint of a law firm he had long considered neutral. "It's clean." Luca felt the noose of frustration curl. The idea that legal frameworks could be weaponized against him with such finesse angered him in a deep way. It meant his enemies had friends in places he had thought quiet. More than that, he hated the way Elena's frustration tightened her features. She had not expected to be outmaneuvered. The people she had been scraping crumbs for were better at chess than she'd thought. "We'll go public," he said. "Expose the shell in the firm, make them bleed in the courthouse and in the press." She flinched. "If we expose them, they will expose Matteo." He did not reply at first because the calculus was complicated by the human measure. He could bulldoze the firm and its partners and then reward the collateral damage with money and favor. But the network had a talent for retaliating not with cargo, but with family. Elena's brother had hung in this story like a lit fuse. Any loud movement could reduce him to ash. "You want me to let them take him?" she demanded. The plea in her voice was jagged and unadorned. For the first time, resentment spiraled across the table, between a man who could reorder economies and a woman who could not let her family be used as ornaments on someone else's ledger. Luca looked at her, really looked at her. The way her mouth drew into a line, the way her shoulders curled, the way fear and resolve braided into a single posture. He had always thought of power as a clean blade. Elena's life taught him power felt more like rope. It could bind, it could support, it could strangle. He did not like the truth that rose in him. He was fond of her in a way he had not been fond of anyone outside of loyalty and blood. The fondness made his decisions muddy. "Then we move quietly," he said. "We take the ledger they think only the courts can read. We find their soft points and pry them open. We do it without announcing our hand." She let out a breath like a small release valve. "You realize that means I go back in," she said. "I will need to make contact, feed them curated lies, and then, if I can, find the nodes." "You will not go alone," he said. She looked at him then, not as his secretary, not as a cracked artifact of necessity, but like someone assessing whether a rising tide was rescue or drowning. "And if I am found?" "You will be punished," he answered, the word flat and final. He hated it for both of them. He hated it because he would have to enact it if she failed. The thought of hurting her for a failure that would have been orchestrated by others was almost unbearable. Her silence afterward was not surrender, but consideration. She slid a hand into the pocket of her coat, as she had done when she gave the envelope to the man by the river, an old reflex, and withdrew a small, worn photograph of a boy with flour on his cheek and a crooked smile. Matteo. She placed it on the desk between them. It smelled faintly of bread. "You will not make threats about him that you do not mean," she said quietly. "I will not make threats at all," he replied, and found that in this, perhaps, he was lying. He would warn, he would coerce, he would do anything to keep her from the kind of pain that gnawed at his own chest when he imagined the world without the small mercies she provided. "But I will do what it takes." They struck an uneasy bargain. She would go back in, but under his watch. She would feed and map and lie and, if necessary, be sacrificed. He would marshal resources, arrange safe houses, and tighten the net around the men who traded in family. The work called for patience, for improvisation, for the kind of closeness that reconfigured their roles into something more dangerous and intimate than either had allowed. They were partners in necessity, an alliance forged in the iron of bad choices and the small, stubborn defiance of love that had not yet named itself. As she left his office that night, the snow had stopped, and the streetlight threw long gold knives across the pavement. Elena lifted her face to the sky as if measuring how much cold a person could take. Luca watched her go, the photograph heavy with implication, and felt a new ledger opening in his chest, where numbers were not the only sums being counted. He had made an agreement that could either save them both or ruin them. The city outside his window hummed, oblivious, and the network, patient, clever, lethal, continued to breathe in the dark. The first step of their plan bent toward a singular act. Elena would access a private ledger, a digital spine that linked promises to deeds, and retrieve a string of transactions that would identify the law firm's clients. To get it, she would have to become what she had tried to stop being, a ghost in places where ghosts were hunted. Betrayal would be her tool. Deception would be how she saved her brother. The cost would be a piece of her that might never come back. As she prepared to go, Luca handed her a small black device, compact, brutal, military grade. "If you need extraction," he said, "press this." She took it like a votive. Her fingers brushed his, a contact that carried more than the simple exchange of an object. It was a friction of lives. She did not look at him when she left, but neither did she look away. Night swallowed her silhouette, and something else, an unspoken promise that both of them would test the limits of what they were willing to break. The first time Elena stepped back into the world she had tried to leave, the air felt like entry into a different language. She put on the mask she'd worn for months, the neutral gait, the surface-level jokes, the faked boredom when men tried to flirt with a woman's hands moved like instruments, and she felt it scrape at the raw places inside her. Luca's device warmed against her palm like a talisman. She breathed it in and out, memorizing its weight as if it could anchor her to the promise of rescue. She arranged a meeting with a name she'd been feeding the network for months, Carlo Vela, a courier and a man who handled the smaller, more plausible trades. Vela had always been a middleman, a gatekeeper who left no fingerprints, until the day Elena found him outside the courthouse, cigarette smoke spilling like a rumor from between his fingers. He smiled with teeth that knew too many lies. "You're back," he said without pretense. "I'm back," she answered, and the voice she used belonged to a woman who had practiced her detachment until the edges of pity had been shaved down. She showed him a fabricated file, a folder of misdirections that Luca's team had helped her create, and watched him read it with the professional patience of a man measuring profit. He nodded, small and sharp. "Caruso is patient," he said. "He doesn't rush. He plays for the long game. You should be careful." She smiled, and the smile felt brittle. "Careful is a default," she said. Inside, the gears turned. Luca's men watched the meeting through a feed that disguised itself as an advertisement on the cafe's Wi-Fi, and his voice was a static behind her shoulder, present in an absence. It made her feel like an animal under observation, every twitch catalogued. Vela handed her a new contact, a solicitor who wore linen in winter and had an office with too many books. "She files a lot of favors," Vela said. "Not her hands, someone else's. Follow her paperwork." He tapped his temple as if thought were a currency. "Find the patterns." Elena left the cafe with the lawyer's name in her pocket and a coldness she tried on like a coat. Inside the compound, Luca watched the video and saw how she clenched her jaw the moment Vela smiled, how her fingers tightened around the coffee cup like someone trying to squeeze warmth from a stone. He felt his chest constrict with a sort of private fury he had never named. Concern, yes, but also a near superstitious dread that she was out in the world wearing his decisions like clothes she had not asked to inherit. They pushed at the network with the care of men who diffuse minds. Elena fed them curated lies. She misdirected funds to shadow companies Luca owned and then pulled them back at the last minute. She made calls in which her voice trembled just enough to be believable. She was a spectacular liar in the service of truth, an inversion of herself she lived through like a series of small deaths. Each time she returned to the safe room, Luca read her like a book with pages he could not always fathom. He would ask a question, and she would answer with the minimal truth she could afford. Between them sat a new language of omissions that smelled faintly of betrayal, but also of survival. One night, after a run that left her shaking, Elena found Luca waiting in the corridor outside the secure room. The light from the emergency exit painted his profile in a halo she hadn't seen before, hard edges softened by exhaustion. She wanted to be angry at him for the chain of things she had been forced to do. Instead, she found her anger collapsing into something that felt astonishingly like grief. "You sent me to lie to people who would gut me if they caught me," she said without raising her voice. "You promised we wouldn't make noise, and every step in there felt like a trap." He folded his arms the way men do when they want to appear unreadable. "And you survived. That's not the same as winning." Her words were quick, spare. "They know me now in places they didn't before." "And?" he asked, and the single syllable was a test and an invitation. "They will come for me differently," she said. "If they suspect me, they won't just take Matteo. They'll take what I protected and turn it into a way to hurt you." Luca listened and felt the room thin. He had thought the risk was only to the ledger, to shipments and algorithms. He had not measured the ways in which the world could fracture when a woman like Elena, whose loyalty had been bought by the desperate hand of family, was placed between two predators. The idea of the network triangulating on her made his teeth ache. "I know," he said finally, "and I will not let them take you." Her laugh was unexpected, sharp, and humorless. "You have a habit of saying what makes you feel like a father or a judge. Then call me an ally," he said. "Call me what you must in order to keep breathing." There was a fragile truce in that, one stitched with equal parts pragmatism and yearning. They returned to the work with a new intensity. Elena began to see patterns not as isolated nodes, but as strings leading back to a hub. The law firm was not the hub, only a branch. And every time they cut one thread, they found another. It was like tending a plant only to find its roots deeper than the soil allowed. 3 months into their clandestine campaign, when they had managed to shut down several small shell companies and to reroute funds in ways that left their rivals poorer and oddly violated, Caruso made his move. He targeted Luca's most vulnerable asset, a shipping lane that ran medicine to a district of the city where loyalty was built on small favors and old debts. The seizure was clean, legal, and public, an injunction that made the headlines and forced Luca into a defensive posture he had not worn in years. He felt the familiar edge of fury. He felt, too, the panic of a man who had always defined himself by the ability to prevent this very thing. Elena watched the news with him, sharing the same silence. The worry on her face had nothing to do with the ledger and everything to do with someone's small life suspended by a court order. "They're playing chess with people's lives," she said. "Not just money." "And they're inviting us to play loud," Luca replied. "They want to make a spectacle." He wanted to answer publicly, open war, expose Caruso, let the city see. But Elena's presence at his side complicated the calculus in a way he hadn't been prepared for. The more public he became, the more he risked the safety of a man whose face had once been a photograph on Elena's desk. "Elena," he said after a moment, the name a private thing now. "You need to disappear for a week." She looked at him, both incredulous and understanding. "Disappear?" "Off the maps," he said. "No phone, no contact. Stay in the safe house. I will handle the publicity." She stared at him, the hurt like a raw thing exposed under skin. "You want me safe, and you want me hidden like an object you might forget." "No." He stepped closer than he had in weeks. "I want you alive." She looked at him then, not at the man who held the city, but at the man who had become a set of soft gestures toward her, and she saw for the first time that the armor he wore was not seamless. It had seams that could be pried open by something as simple as concern. "Disappear," she repeated, voice thin. "And then what? You put on your war face and tell the world that you don't care who pays? I will do what I have to do, and I will come back for you." She left for the safe house the next night, and Luca watched the taxi take her away with the keen awareness of a man who had never learned to wait. The city closed around him like a fist. He moved public pieces, a press release that framed the injunction as an attack on trade and an old business rival, but his shadow work was quieter and bloodier. He had men shadow judges, he leaked rumors of misconduct, he quietly bribed clerks. The war he waged was not only against Caruso, it was against time itself. Then came the fracture that no ledger could predict. A feed crossed Elena's laptop in the safe house, a message threaded through what she thought was a secure channel, a message that used a phrase she had used only to Luca when they negotiated terms. The phrase was small, private, a joke about coffee and schedules, and someone had it. Someone had been listening inside the rooms where she felt safe. Panic moved through her like cold water. She pressed the device Luca had given her until it hummed, a call no one should have heard. The line went dead. The safe house, empty, felt suddenly porous, like a room with the window left open. She called Luca with hands that did not steady. "They have something," she whispered. "They can mimic me. They can mimic my voice." "You're sure?" he asked, and his voice was not the same as the man who had given her the device. His tone was dangerous in a way she feared. "Yes. Get out," he said. "Leave now." She packed, hands moving in brutal efficiency. The photograph of Matteo she folded into her pocket and pressed close to her chest like a talisman. She left the safe house and walked into the night, every shadow suddenly a possible enemy. 2 blocks away, a sedan idled, and the man at the wheel held the window down to watch the street like a sentinel. Luca's men were there too, some of them planted like anchors, some of them like fishermen waiting for the line to twitch, but it did not feel like enough. Elena moved like a woman who had learned to carry a life in a single photograph, and Luca watched her silhouette and knew he had misread the ways threat could enter their world. He had believed the network to be a thing of algorithms and shell companies, not the intimacy of mimicry, not the way someone could sound like her on the phone and make the men in power believe they had a right to coerce. When Elena reached the sedan, 2 figures stepped out from the shadows. They wore suits that could have belonged to anyone and smiles that had practiced softness. One of them spoke in a voice that was crafted to unspool courage. "Elena," he said, and the single name landed with an intimacy that made her knees want to buckle. "You should come with us." Luca was on them before they could take another breath. He moved like a storm, fast, precise, and furious. Men spilled from doorways, the street filled with the sound of colliding wills. In the chaos, Elena watched Luca fight like someone protecting an altar. The fight ended quickly. It was not a cinematic battle, but a surgical removal of threat. The men in suits were taken, bound and silent, their smiles collapsing into something like fear. When it was over, Luca picked Elena up like a thing he was not sure the world had the right to keep. She let him, weighty and small at once, lean against his chest as if it were shelter. The city around them breathed out and returned to its indifferent hum. "I told you to disappear," he said, words raw. "You didn't." "You told me to trust you," she whispered back. "I did." He guided her to the nearest safe room and shut the door like a benediction. They sat across from one another with the distance of 2 people who had come close enough to be wounded by truth. Elena had been betrayed not merely by the network, but by the intimacy of someone who knew the private textures of her voice. Luca had been betrayed not only in his ledger, but in the discovery that the enemy had the patience to mimic what she had given to him. The fracture between them was not immediate like glass. It was a slow, widening thing that began to show in the way they spoke, in the way the room felt colder when one of them left. Luca's trust had been earned in minutes and broken in the fence of months. Elena's protection had been given and then compromised. They had both traded pieces of themselves in an effort to save a life. That night, when the city outside went on believing itself safe, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and watched her hands. She had wanted to be effective. Instead, she had become a piece on a board she had not realized was being arranged. Tears came, silent and furious, because she saw how far she had slid from the woman who once walked into law firms and read server logs like scripture. She had become a liar by necessity, and now feared she had opened a door that could not be closed. Luca did not come to the bed. He remained in the dim corridor, a man made of decisions, his silhouette a testament to the way power requires solitude. He listened to her tears like a tally and felt them as his own failure. He had promised protection and had failed. He had offered her an alliance and now watched it crack. His empire had taught him to bury sentiment, but the sight of Elena, The woman who had given him the only small comforts he permitted hurt in a way financial loss or lost shipments never did. They were bound together by the same fracture now. The network's mimicry had shown them how hollow the division between control and vulnerability could be. They had both been used, and the wound left in their partnership felt like a map with missing roads. When dawn came, it brought with it a decision that tasted like iron. They could continue to trust one another enough to fight the network, or they could walk away with nothing more than a ledger of nerves and regrets. Elena looked at Luka with a determination that had been honed by fear and necessity. "I will go back," she said. "I will be the voice they want, but I will also leave them breadcrumbs that lead only to ruins." He looked at her, and for the first time in months let his eyes admit a softness he had kept locked away. "Then we burn it," he said. "We make their patience our liability. We will make them pay for learning to mimic what is human." She nodded, and the nod carried the weight of a woman who had decided that she would no longer be only a chess piece. They would fight, but the fight would no longer be a game she played alone. Their partnership, with all its cracks, with all its trembling loyalties, would either become the weapon they needed or the thing that would be used to punish them both. Outside, the city woke to headlines about legal battles and rail delays. Inside, two people who had learned the intimate geometry of each other began to assemble a plan with the brittle hope of the desperate. In the end, secrets had severed them, and truth had nearly finished the job. Now, with fractures otherwise neat and dangerous, they would decide whether love, messy, unexpected, and perilous, would be the tool that stitched them back together, or the thing that finally broke them apart. They planned the burn like men planning a funeral, with a grim tenderness, rituals that made the inevitable feel less like chaos and more like a necessary closing. Luka fed the network lies that smelled like truth, fake ledgers that traced money to ghost accounts and then looped back into shell companies that belonged to him. Elena rehearsed her voices until the mimicry that had once betrayed her felt like a weapon she could wield. Together, they composed an aria of deception that would draw Matteo Caruso's patience into a trap. The night they struck, the city had the brittle hush of a thing holding its breath. Luka drove them toward the outskirts in a vehicle without plates. Elena sat beside him, hands folded over the photograph of Matteo. They did not speak much. Words were expensive, and they had to save them for the moments when calculation failed and feeling intruded. He caught her wrist once and did not let go, an anchor for both of them. She squeezed back, permission without promise. Their plan hinged on one risky thing: make Caruso believe his network had found and compromised Elena's last sanctuary, then give him a clean, tempting ledger to follow. When he arrived, fast and furious, riding on the satisfaction of a man who thinks himself inevitable, Luka's men would close the net. It was theatrical, and it relied on an arrogance Caruso had always worn like cologne. They set the stage in an abandoned freight terminal, a place of rust and shadow. Elena would be the bait. She would make contact with the man who acted as one of Caruso's legal eyes and offer him a piece of the ledger she had stolen. Luka planted cameras and men disguised as dock workers until the terminal looked like the heart of an ordinary smuggling route. The air was thin and smelled of iron. Elena's throat hummed with the knowledge that she was walking into the mouth of whatever beast they had made. When the man arrived, a sleek, pleasant consultant who believed himself untouchable, Elena played the part of the broken traitor with a skill born of months in worse roles. She unfolded the fake ledger like an offering and watched his eyes travel across numbers that promised vindication. He smiled with the inevitability of someone who thinks his side holds the map. At the signal, Luka's men moved. The consultant tried to retreat. A gun barked in answer. Caruso did not arrive as a shadow this time, but as an accusation, A black sedan, smoke like a promise, the shoulders of the man who stepped out wearing patience as armor. He had expected a slow harvest. Instead, he found fireworks. Caruso's voice was a rasp of old money and older grudges. "You think you can make me dance?" he asked Luca across the terminal, but his eyes were on Elena, measuring, tasting. She held his look with a calm that surprised even her. In that look, she offered him nothing. She offered Luca everything. The battle that followed was not a cinematic spectacle so much as a series of sharp decisions. Men collapsing into alleyways, a flare of gunfire that lit faces in orange punctuation. Luca fought with a brutal efficiency, every movement a ledger entry paid in muscle and breath. Elena moved too, not with a gun, but with the small, precise sabotage she had become expert in. She severed a communications line, misdirected a van, whispered a code into an earpiece that sent a trapdoor into motion. Together, they worked like a machine composed of two aching hearts. When the terminal fell quiet, Caruso lay bound beneath a tangle of chain, and his eyes were not the cold ones recorded in rumor, but small and surprised, like a man who had been caught believing himself immortal. Luca stood over him, and for a moment the city outside might have been erased. There was only breath and the heavy aftermath of choice. "What do you want?" Caruso spat, the question a bargaining chip.
"I want you to forget that you ever thought you could buy the people who keep this city alive," Luca said. He walked to Elena and put his hand on her shoulder, an emblem of ownership, yes, but also of something like gratitude. "And I want my ledger clean." Caruso laughed, a wet sound, then coughed. He traded names with the practiced cruelty of a man used to corridors where people traded lives like currency. Luca listened and then, with the patience they had both learned, cut deals that would strip Caruso of legal influence. A public denunciation, a leaked file that exposed his shell counsel, witnesses coaxed into truth. They made the man small in ways the law appreciated. In the dark that followed, when the men untied the ropes and the cameras shut off, Elena felt the exhaustion of her deception finally meet the cost. Matteo's name had stayed safe for now. The network recoiled as its calculations had been proven wrong. But the victory came with a ledger of its own, one written in things neither of them could fully recover. Elena's name had been dragged through mud in places she couldn't scrub. Men who had once courted her favor now looked at her like a commodity. Luca had burned a part of his anonymity and invited new enemies, men who wouldn't forget humiliation. They retreated to the safe house, where night felt larger and softer after the violence. Elena sat on a metal chair and let the adrenaline unspool. Luca watched her with a tenderness that had the quality of confession. "You could have walked away," she said finally, voice frayed. "You didn't have to do this." He stepped closer and cupped her face with hands that had signed decrees and killed deals and occasionally tempered his fury with gentleness. "I didn't want you to be another debt I paid for," he said. "I wanted to make sure you chose to stay." Her laugh was brief, shocked. "You make it sound like a charity." "I make it sound like truth." He bent until their foreheads met, a small, intimate architecture of two tired people. In his eyes, she read something that had been building in quiet, the softer territory where habit becomes affection, where obligation becomes desire. "I lied to you," she whispered, the admission a shard of vulnerability. "I lied to save him." "You did more than you allowed yourself to admit," Luca said. There was no pardon in his voice, no absolution, only recognition. He lowered his lips to hers, not as conquest, but as an offering. The kiss was desperate and tender, a contract in a world where contracts were usually signed in blood. Elena responded with the kind of hunger that comes not from want, but from relief. Relief that someone had seen the terrible choices and still reached out. When they parted, she pressed the photograph of Matteo between them, a small artifact that smelled of bread and belonging. "I will make a life for him that doesn't ask me to betray," she said. And I will try, if you let me, to be the woman who can keep her hands clean."
Luca's laugh was the softest thing she had heard from him. "I don't know if we can both be clean," he admitted, "but I know I'd rather be dirty with you than alone." They spent the remaining hours patching up the world they had torn apart. Calls to lawyers, quiet settlements, the discreet placement of funds that would help Matteo vanish into a life without menace. Luca arranged for witnesses and for safe relocation and signed papers that had the sterile language of protection. Elena watched him convert his power into something like benevolence and felt a warmth that was not merely relief. Morning came like a promise that frightened them both. Matteo left with a new name and a road that would take him far from the counting rooms of men who traded in debt. Elena stood at the window and watched the taxi fade into the city, a small figure clutching a photograph of a woman who had burned for him. She turned when Luca stepped into the room, his face bearing the calm of a man who had made costly choices and had not regretted them. "You sacrificed for him," he said quietly, and the sentence held no chastisement. "And you risked everything to keep me," she answered. He closed the distance until they could no longer hide the tender stakes. "Then we keep what we made," he said. "We rebuild what was broken and be braver with how we hold one another." She nodded, and for the first time since she had walked into his glass cube suspended over the city, Elena allowed herself to imagine a life where the ledger balanced not only in numbers, but in small human currencies: trust, protection, a shared name for what they were to one another. They would carry the scars, the mimicry of voices, the debts of secrecy. But those marks would not erase the fragile fact that two people from opposite battlements had chosen to stand together. Outside, the city moved on, a landscape of deals and deadlines and dangers. Inside the safe room, Elena and Luca arranged the architecture of a future that would not be easy, but that might be honest in ways both had never believed possible. The redemption they'd bought was not free. That had a price they would pay in the currency of small sacrifices and daily bravery. As they sat close, hands entwined, the photograph of Matteo between them felt less like a debt and more like a promise. That some lives, once protected, could be allowed to be ordinary again. They had reclaimed what the network had tried to steal: control, dignity, the right to choose. And in doing so, had traded ledger entries for something new and dangerous: the tentative tabulation of two hearts learning to keep each other. They learned how to live with the aftermath the way sailors learn to read the weather, by watching, by listening, by altering course before a storm could crown. Days that followed were small acts of repair. Elena taught Luca how to read the quiet, soft signals of the people he'd been raised to command. Luca taught Elena how to let someone else carry weight without turning every favor into a ledger. They rebuilt the lines of power not by seizing every last advantage, but by asking what victory would cost if it meant losing each other. Matteo was gone to a coastline where bread was cheap and the air did not taste of threat.